Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us on this session. We have Paul Abraham, who's the founder of Sarmaya, and he'll be in conversation today with Avik Chanda, who's the author of the book that we're going to discuss further and talk about, Dara Shukoh. So over to you, Paul.
Here's the book. Okay, Avik, thank you so much, and welcome to Sarmaya Salon today. And we'll talk about Dara Shukoh, and arguably one of the most intriguing characters in the Mughal pantheon, who was never to be, and yet uh, there's so much, well, I don't want to use the word controversy, but, there's always this question of what if Dara had made it? I mean, after all, he was formally declared heir apparent.
Yes, Lord.
The realpolitik played its part, and finally he was not to be. So first, give me the big picture. When someone asks you about what if, what's your answer?
So Paul, good evening, and many thanks for inviting me to the Sarmaya Salon. I remember we were going to do an in-person event the third week of March, and then of course the pandemic hit us. I'm so happy that at least in a virtual mode we are doing this. And yes, Dara Shukoh is one of those greatly sort of debatable and debated figures in Indian history. And we have different sort of variants of history being revisited and alternate history being talked about, that if he had become the ruler, and there are two or three aspects to this, right? A, would people in general have been happier? Would, that have been a glorious reign? And at the same time, the flip side of the coin is what would have actually happened to the empire? How stable would it have been? How robust would it have been, right? So I think whenever we are, and both of these, right, we are going into the realms of speculation. So first, maybe we should take a step back and think a little bit about Dara Shukoh in terms of his behavioral traits. Put a pop psychology hat on and talk a little bit about his behavioral traits, right? So the commonly received narrative is that he was, the dreamy-eyed, otherworldly philosopher prince, the ultimate philosopher prince, which is true, because he was a practicing Qadiri Sufi. He was a theologian with deeply innovative, original, and sort of syncretic viewpoints. He was a calligrapher, he was a chronicler, he was a poet in his own right, and he had a divan that he was able to complete during his lifetime, called Iksar-e-Azam. A connoisseur of the fine arts, and that's something that we'll be talking about later. Almost collaborating with the atelier of artists to come up with his Dara Shukoh album. And he was, unlike many of the potentates or many of the princely figures that we find, a genuinely warm-hearted person. You could say, in modern terminology, a family man. An obedient and a dutiful son, a loving father, a loving husband, and so forth. But that is one aspect of him. The other aspect of him is that he was incredibly vain. He was extremely supercilious, and he could cut people off, and he did fairly regularly do that in court, in his private life. And he would do that across the board. So he would be equally sort of curt and dismissive when it came to the Muslim clerics, the ulema, similarly the Hindus. The Muslim commanders, similarly the Rajput commanders. He was extremely susceptible. That actually goes back to him being a poor judge of character more than anything else. He was extremely susceptible to sycophancy, and very, very gullible when it came to all kinds of self-styled yogis and babas and fakirs and mystics. And he was very, very reliant on astrology. Not completely unknown back in those days, but he was overtly so. So when you take the two of these together, right, you find a very complex sort of mix of things. So I just wanted to give this background before we even start to talk about the what-if question.
Yeah, so I think just to paint that picture, in terms of the events that surrounded Dara, Dara's circumstances also kind of played their part. Dara was born when his father was still Khurram, not Shah Jahan.
Yes.
Jahangir was sitting on the throne. Dara was born in Ajmer. So in many ways, seen to be, auspicious in terms of the way and the place he was born. So there was a lot of mysticism, and the fact that he was born in Ajmer, there was a certain spirituality, associated
with that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then there was also the fact that around that time, or shortly thereafter, as part of the accession, his father had literally rebelled against Jahangir and was running all over the country trying to escape the Mughal forces which Jahangir had set after him. And so much so that, at one point, Shah Jahan is defeated and he has to surrender, Khurram is defeated and he has to surrender these children as hostages to Jahangir. In that confinement, also, I think he kind of immersed himself in literature and books because there was pretty much little else to do in captivity. So the fact that, there was this, his early teacher was Mullah Haravi, who was coincidentally from the Qadiriya sect of Sufis. So, his circumstance in terms of confinement, his birthplace, his teachers, everything seemed to kind of, build a narrative around him that he was that otherworldly, right?
Yes, yes. I mean, if you think about it and you try and play it out in sort of modern terminology, it would have been an extremely eventful, at times traumatic early childhood that he would have spent, because his earliest memories would have been that of his father being the darling of the court, the crown prince, being the Baba Khurram, the favorite, the apple of the Emperor Jahangir's eye. And then almost overnight, there is a rift between them. And from Baba Khurram, and this is from the Jahangirnama itself, right? He becomes the Bedalat, the wretched, right? And from there's this definite fall from grace, and it's history repeating itself, right? Just like Jahangir, as the Crown Prince Salim had reneged or rebelled against his own father, Akbar, Shah Jahan, as Prince Khurram, does exactly the same. And as you said, even though he was a very able commander in the field of battle and an astute politician in his day, Shah Jahan or Prince Khurram, his forces were absolutely no match for the might of the imperial, the Shahi Fauj. So he got beaten, and he was literally, as you said, right, going from Burhanpur further down south to Gujarat, towards the east, and trying to consolidate his position, having desperate bids and desperate sort of takeover and makeover attempts over the local jagirdars, the zamindars, to try and consolidate his position and put up some kind of a defense. And when all of that failed, essentially Prince Khurram throws his hands up and says, he becomes a penitent, right? So he says, I am sorry for what I have done. And that is the document that reaches the court. And Jahangir, of course, at that point of time was certainly under the influence of many of his nobles, but definitely under the influence of Noor Jahan, the empress. And it was decreed that Prince Khurram, his life and his safety would be spared, right? So his safety would be taken care of, provided he sends his sons as hostage to the fortress of Lahore. So yes, that was 1 year of confinement under the watchful eye of Noor Jahan, except that even within that 1 year, it was tremendously disruptive. There was a coup So there's Muhammad Khan who takes over and who kidnaps Shah Jahan, the Jahangir, sorry, and Noor Jahan is kind of forced into this almost house arrest kind of a thing, and then they're rescued, and he comes back, is reinstated properly as the Shahanshah, and is not able to see the fruits of that, because shortly afterwards he's taken ill and he actually dies, and then there's a mini war of succession that begins, and which was anything but bloodless. So Dara Shukoh would have had, from the fringes, elements of that. He would have experienced what the courtiers are saying, what people are saying, and then Asaf Khan brings him into his own pana, right, into his own custody, and make sure that the young princes are brought safe and sound to their own mother, Mumtaz Mahal. So yes.
Then you have this scenario where Dara marries Nadira Begum and has his first daughter in 1639 at an age of 19 years. And, he's deeply in love with Nadira. He's, besotted by the birth of the daughter. And then shortly after her birth, she dies. And he actually goes into a deep state of depression and melancholy. And, the only way he is kind of pulled out of that is when he's taken to Mian Mir, who's at that time the head of the Qadiriya sect and who formally accepts him as a disciple. And in some senses, the Qadiriyas were actually a group that had a lot of dialogue, especially with Hindu yogis and saints. And therefore, I think the initial seeds of Advaita philosophy, monotheism, etc., was sowed in Dara's mind. So can you talk about that early phase?
So this is, as you pointed out, right? He was still in his late teens when he was married to his cousin Nadira Begum, and it was an incredibly happy one. It was a love story for the times, because people talk about Mumtaz Mahal and Shah Jahan, or people talk about Jahangir and Noor Jahan. So this is the love story that people do not talk about, which did endure a good 3 decades. And when he was absolutely overjoyed when his daughter was born, and then he was with his father in campaign when news of his infant daughter, who had just been 3 or 4 months old, news of her death reaches him, and he's completely distraught. He literally, devolves. He disintegrates into pieces. He cannot eat, he cannot sleep, and is completely beside himself with grief. What is important is to look at his condition, his depression, his plight in the light of the Mughal lineage. Now, let's remember, after all, we are talking about a line of potentates that is, that is descended directly from Amir Timur, or Timur the Lame, on the father's side, and the no less fearsome, no less hated and feared, Genghis Khan, the mother's side. Right? So it's incredibly important to know this, and even when you see Babur, and even when you see Akbar in his time when he had to be ruthless, and Shah Jahan in his own time, when you compare that with this extremely vulnerable, overly sensitive, emotional young prince, you get a feel that here is a person, and you get an early feel that here is a person who is probably not cut out for the vagaries and the cruelties of contemporary sort of courtly life, or life as it were. So one of the things that happens is around that time when his daughter dies and he's completely distraught, things come to a stead where, to the extent of almost the entire darbar coming to a standstill, that is what happens. Shah Jahan is unable to conduct his campaign, is unable to conduct his moving darbar, his itinerant darbar. And he's forced to take his son literally from pillar to post. And he's forced to go to all the doctors, including, starting with the royal physicians, the imperial physicians, and the imperial physicians tell him that, look, there is nothing that we can do because he's physically not ill. This is an affliction of the mind. This is an ailment of the soul. This is not something that we can cure with our science, with our art. And that is when Shah Jahan, who is otherwise, unlike Akbar, or unlike to a fairly large extent, unlike Jahangir, he is then forced to take his son to the Sufis, to the Babas, to the Pirs. And one such incident happens when he takes Dara Shukoh to the Qadiri Pir, the saint Mian Mir in Lahore. And at that point of time, he undergoes a complete transformation. He has this complete epiphany. And that's when, the saint asks him to draw near and then embraces him. And it is an absolutely deafening, shattering kind of an experience for Dara Shukoh. And that then leads him to become a murid, to become an apprentice or a novitiate of the Qadiri Silsila.
So then he finds inspiration in his elder sister Jahanara. She's kind of inspiration for him, and in in all of this, he's introduced to this book, the Nafahat ul-Ans, which is the life of about 100 Sufi saints, and he's determined that he's going to take up a project to write about all the Sufi saints in a manner that the common man understands it. So he embarks on this new project. And at that time, he, Shah Jahan all the time has kept him strongly by his side. And in some senses, he and Jahanara are the triumvirate that is, literally running the empire. Mm-hmm. But he kind of ignores all of that. He immerses himself in this project and finally publishes the Safinatul Awliya in 1639. And then that's the time Shah Jahan has built a new capital, moved to Shahjahanabad, right? So take us through that moment in his life, because I think that's the point when people around him are starting to see him as this disconnected, disdainful person.
Absolutely. But think about this, right? A Mughal prince in his late teens would have got his first mansab. And by the time he was 20 or maybe even 17 or 18, he would be really gearing to go to prove himself to his father, to prove himself to the Shahanshah, and go on a military campaign. Unlike that, Dara is this otherworldly, scholarly, but aloof prince who is literally his father's shadow. And think about the momentous things which are happening right through the 1630s. So a huge project is being undertaken by the Shahanshah himself, which is a new capital of the empire. Shahjahanabad is coming into play. It's coming into form. Dara could have immersed himself in that project. To an extent, Jahanara did. And this is recorded, that part of the town planning and taking a look at the Charbagh in Isfahan and other models from the Islamic period or the Persian architecture is one of the main models, one of the inspirations that Jahanara takes to come up with her vision of the Chandni Chowk, which of course is a very far cry of the Chandni Chowk of Delhi that we know today, but the Chandni Chowk back in that time, architecturally in terms of town planning. So even the extremely philosophical, poetic-minded Jahanara found herself excited about the project of being able to contribute to a new, grand, rich, opulent capital of the empire. But not so Dara Shukoh. What does he do? He writes two chronicles. One is going all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad and his followers up until a few centuries before his time. And the second one is to talk about, is to chronicle the lives of the Sufis who are more contemporary to chronicle the lives of Mia of the likes of Mia or Mullah Shah, or even the odd Hindu Aztec. So these are the projects that he has in mind. And alongside this, what is the other project that he has in mind? So Shah Jahan, back in the day, had Chitarman and Bichitra and a whole huge atelier of painters that were there in the studio, and they had produced this incredibly beautiful and richly sort of produced collection called the Muraka, which we now know to be the Shah Jahan album. Now, Dara Shukoh could have become a politician, could have said, okay, I want to go on some military campaign, could have immersed himself into town planning or the setting up of the capital. He does none of this. He's writing two chronicles one after the other and thinking up more such literary and theological projects. And he is collaborating with the artists of the Imperial Atelier, sort of leased out to him, to have his own album with a view to presenting that to his beloved wife.
Yes.
So that gives you a very distinct kind of a feel of this is the kind of person that he is. Very, very un-Mughal prince-like.
Yeah, though that all of the emperors prior had actually embarked on significant projects. For example, Akbar had on the Hamzanama and things like that, and they were multi-year projects. And this was also something that he literally started in early 1630s. And in 1633, he got married to Nadira Begum. And then in 1640-41 is when this project completes, and he makes a grand presentation of that to Nadira as a mark of his, deep affection, bond, love for his wife. So it's a huge project. But having said that, he kind of chooses what he wants to immerse himself in, while all his brothers have been dispatched to the provinces. So, one is in Bengal, Shuja is in Bengal, Aurangzeb is in the Deccan, Murad is in, Gujarat and all of these places. And, they are kind of soiling their hands, so to speak. And, Dara in the meantime is actually meeting up with, saints, philosophers, etc. Now, there is an episode that does happen, and that is in 1644, when Jahanara, her clothes catch fire, and there's a very, very serious accident, and she's burnt, and all the brothers rush back to the imperial capital and to be with the sister. And at that point, there is also a moment in which Aurangzeb complains to Shah Jahan that Dara meddles in all the affairs of, the state. He's sitting in, far away, Shah Jahanabad. He's actually meddling in the affairs of the Deccan, which is not taken lightly by Shah Jahan. And Shah Jahan actually strips him of all the titles. And Aurangzeb is literally furious. And I think that's when the first part of that formal, enmity and the hate for mutual hate starts, right? So one is Dara's phase where he's kind of switched himself into this disdainful, ignoring people, not engaging, doing his own thing. And the next thing is where the brothers are now slowly starting to gang up.
Yes, absolutely. Very early on, what happens is by the time Aurangzeb is 16 and by the time Murad Bakhsh and Shuja are also in their late teens, the emperor dispatches all of them to the various provinces of the empire. So Murad Bakhsh is sent westwards into Gujarat, Aurangzeb is sent south into the Deccan, and Shuja is sent towards Bengal. Only Dara, his favorite, the apple of his eye, remains with him, like a ladla, literally. There's no other term for it. And what happens is throughout the next literally 20, 25 years, the brothers have to fend for themselves. Each of the other brothers have to fend for themselves. They have to negotiate the politics, they have to negotiate the infighting, they have to negotiate the intrigues of the provinces, they have to negotiate the different kinds of enemies that they are fighting. So for example, Aurangzeb in the Deccan, he has to look at Golconda, he has to look at Bijapur, he has to look at the Marathas who have reared their heads as a force to be reckoned with, right? So there are all of these situations that he has to negotiate. And when there are campaigns, he has to be able to prove himself as a commander to actually get the respect, to earn the respect of his forces on the ground, fighting on the ground. And at that point of time, Dara Shukoh plays, you could probably say, a behind the scenes power kind of a thing, right? Where he is subtly influencing the emperor against sometimes sending reinforcements to Aurangzeb, against sometimes sending reinforcements to other people. And that plays out disastrously because Aurangzeb, being the very, very sharp, politically minded person that he is, he figures that out. And unlike Dara, who has very few friends at court, Aurangzeb does have friends in court. So Saadullah Khan, who is the Wazir-e-Azam or the Prime Minister, is kind of aligned. I mean, Aurangzeb befriends him during some of his visits to the imperial court. And he, together with certain other sects of people, are able to filter messages to him saying, this is what is happening. This is what the Crown Prince would have said. So he has this huge sense of resentment that is boiling up inside him, festering inside him. Literally a pressure cooker situation. Think about it for like 2 decades, 2.5 decades, which explains when he finally, the War of Succession begins, why he acts to an extent with such cruelty, brutality.
And then shortly thereafter, the famous Kandahar campaign happens, which was nothing but an unmitigated disaster for Dara. He was literally, that was the first major campaign he was asked to lead. And he literally flops. And at that time, he kind of expresses his displeasure at his, generals, especially Mahabat Khan, Kilich Khan, and the Rajputs. So he literally, alienates them. So I'm just trying to build a little bit of a, picture around how he switches off, he fights with his own siblings, then he is kind of losing the connect with who are otherwise extremely loyal to the imperial, tradition.
The court, yes, and the tradition.
To the emperor. But the generals kind of are finding it difficult to deal with Dara.
Let me just prefix this with a little comment about Kandahar, right? Ever since Humayun, right, was in exile in Persia and then he comes back to India, he had offered Kandahar to Shah Tahsin, right? And the offer was not taken. He was very generous, the Shah of Persia, saying, no, this is yours. But thereafter, ever since Akbar came onto the throne and then Jahangir and then Shah Jahan, Kandahar literally went, it was like alternated within the reign of the same emperor. Sometimes it is under the Mughal Empire, sometimes it is under the Persian Empire. So around the time when Shah Jahan begins his reign and well into his reign, Kandahar has again been taken by the emperors of the Shah of Persia, Shah Abbas in this case. So there is a campaign where Aurangzeb is tasked to move from the Deccan, move to the capital, and then upwards to Kabul, to Multan, and take the imperial force or a contingent of the imperial force into Kandahar. And that campaign also results in failure. One of the reasons, and this is something that is very well documented in the Adabi-Alamgiri, one of the reasons why that campaign fails is because Aurangzeb does not get the reinforcements of the arms, the ammunition, the top that he is desperately asking and requesting his father, the emperor. Whenever he's making some headway, he's treated with disdain. Whatever little effort he gives him, whatever little, headway is able to make in that very, very hostile alien territory is treated with disdain, is almost overlooked in the responses, in the letters from his father. But any delay is immediately pounced upon with a huge amount of invective and sarcasm that Shah Jahan pours on his young son. And it dawns very swiftly on Aurangzeb that it is not just Shah Jahan who is behaving this way to him, but he has been influenced, he's been poisoned by the favorite Dada Bhai, right? The elder brother, Dara Shukoh. So that I wanted to give a little bit of a background to that, right? And against this backdrop comes in Dara Shukoh, who has never led any campaign in his entire life. He's already in his late 30s, approaching 40. Not a single campaign to his name, never seen battle. He tells his father, the emperor, where everybody else has failed, I will just go. It's like Caesar, no? Veni vidi vici. I will just go out there. I will see. I will conquer. I will, everything will be at your feet in a matter of days and weeks. And Shah Jahan, this is the surprising thing, blinded by love for his son, he would know better. He had fought against the Rajputs. He had vanquished the power of Mewar, finally, right, during the time of Amar Singh. He had fought and lost against the Shahi Fauj of his own father, Jahangir. He knew exactly what it was to fight and to win and to fight against insurmountable odds and lose valiantly. Shah Jahan was no coward, was no fool when it came to military affairs. He was a very able general in his day. But somehow he loses sight of all of this and he allows Dara to lead. And that is an absolute disaster, as you pointed out, because Dara Shukoh relies more on yogis and fakirs and mystics with all kinds of charms and spells to bring down the fort and its inhabitants and put a spell on the inhabitants of Kandahar, who are, behind a well-entrenched fort with all their muskets pointed downwards, right? And he displays, there's no other word for it, he displays this terrible talent for being able to antagonize everyone who is reporting to him. So everyone in his own team, he's able to alienate and antagonize. So there's the Rajput leader, the chieftain, Jaswant Singh, absolutely, blind in his allegiance to the emperor. He's snubbed, he's insulted, humiliated publicly and antagonized. Similarly, Mahabad Khan and Kilish Khan suffered the same fate. So everyone who goes to Kandahar in his campaign comes back defeated, demoralized, and extremely, extremely resentful of Dara Shukoh.
Yeah. So then on the way back from that campaign is when he meets Baba Lal in Lahore, right? And enters into a lot of conversation, and then he meets the Jesuits and he's engaged with them. And then he's again in a series of publications, two very important ones. One is the Hasanatul Arifin, and the other one was his collection of verses, which is the Iksir-e-Azam. And there are some incredible quotes there, to read some of those quotes. Paradise is where no mullah exists. In the city where a mullah resides, no wise man ever stays. Yeah? These ulema are ignorant before themselves and learned before the ignorant. And then he says, you dwell in the Kaaba and in Somnath and in the enamored lovers' hearts. Now, these are statements which obviously the ulema didn't take too kindly to. And that at this stage, he also published the Tarikatul Hakikat. And in that, it's talking about the journey of the human beings as disciples. And he, for the first time, comes up wearing a ring with Prabhu inscribed on it. And that is, at that stage, he more or less says that his way is the, syncretic way. His way is the Sulh Kul, the universal peace, a bit like in the image of Akbar. but by then he's also the last straw. Literally, the ulema have been totally alienated, right?
Yes, yes. See, again, this was a very deeply personal pursuit for him, this syncretism, this pluralism, when he talks about, for example, Majma al-Bahrain, which is the mingling of the two oceans, and the two oceans in this case being that of Islam and Hinduism. Or when he has this great epiphany, this dream, in fact, and in his dream, he has Yoga Vashisht who appears to him, and there is another figure with Yoga Vashisht whom Dara recognizes as Sri Ramchandra. And Yoga Vashish asks him to approach and asks Sri Ramchandra to embrace him, saying, "This is your brother." So you can think of the sheer impact that this would have on Dara's psyche when he wakes up saying, "Yes, this is what I'm meant to do." And then he calls forth the Brahmin, the Hindu Pandits, and has the Yoga Vashish translated, and then of course we have the Siraj Akbar, etc. Right? So unlike Akbar, whose Sulekul, a large part of the Sulekul, over and above his own personal pluralistic thesis and leanings, a large part of it had to do with diplomacy, a large part of it had to do with politics, not so Dara Shukoh. In Dara Shukoh, it is an intense pursuit of Tawhid, of unity, of being one with the Almighty. And in his pursuit, he traverses through the Islamic canon, through so many of the other faiths, through the faith of the Jews, through the entire Judeo-Christian sort of canon, their scriptures, the Bible, the book of Psalms, and this is something that he writes, and then arrives at this vast literature, this great sort of treasure of the ancient indigenous people, the Hindus of Hindustan, right? So that is kind of his journey. But going back, some of the things that he quoted, and you can imagine, I mean, if today there was somebody in power who said that, that would hog all the time on national television and the national press, all through, even today. But you can think, right, that back in the time, he had appalled and he had completely flabbergasted not only the ulema, who would have taken great umbrage, would have been first shocked and then afraid and then angry in very quick succession. He would have had a very similar effect on the Sanatan Hindu Brahmin Pandits as well. What is this great mingling of Hinduism and Islam? If you go to a Brahmin Purohit back in the day, they wouldn't warm up to this idea either.
That's interesting. Yeah. And then, of course, he also did some incredibly, interesting acts which showed in some senses, his partiality to various people. Like, for example, the campaign to Chittor, when it was almost happening, he prevailed upon Shah Jahan to literally withdraw. Saying, and he made a very public announcement that he loves Rajputs and they are his favorite people and all of that. And a similar thing happened when Srinagar was, they laid siege to Srinagar, and the Hindu Raja there sent an appeal, and Dara interceded on his behalf and had that, where victory was almost assured. He actually had the forces withdrawn. And, there was a lot of consternation around this kind of behavior, especially when it was, battles that involved Hindu kingdoms. He seemed to be, intervening with great alacrity to kind of stop those campaigns.
Yes. So in both of these campaigns, right, so we would have the Wazir Azam, Sadullah Khan himself, leading one of the campaigns, and the other one we have another Muslim commander, Khalilullah Khan. And both of them felt extremely thwarted because their claim to glory would have been to either raise Chittor or take over Srinagar and bring glory to the empire by having more territory, and what beautiful, what picturesque territory, right? In terms of natural surroundings, under the, basically within the folds of the Mughal Empire, and they were prevented in doing so. So again, their enmity, the first thing that this has is that their enmity against Dara Shukoh hardens. Unlike the case of Srinagar, when the Hindu Raja is duly and truly grateful to Dara Shukoh for having saved his empire in his honor and his life, the Rajputs do not really get the picture. And the reason why they do not get the picture, this is interesting, is that they are looking at it, they are getting very mixed signals. So there is this one particular piece where he prevails, but his public announcement, right, is not a Twitter thing that goes viral and reaches 50 million people or 5 million people. You see, this is a letter that is written by him to another Hindu Raja with possibly copies to another 2 or 3 other chieftains, but that's it. Now, if these Hindu Rajas did not trickle it down the line or did not percolate or did not share this in their own darbars, in their own fiefdoms, it would remain there and it would die there. Because as far as the Rajputs are concerned, honor has always been a very, very big thing for them. Right? You know, Jaan Jai Pariman Na Jai, you know, Rajput Kavachan, etc. And what the Rajputs did not and still could not forgive Dara was the way that he had treated them during the battle of, during the campaign of Kandahar, and even apart from that, generally in court, treating them with great disdain, treating them with great superciliousness, with great haughtiness and arrogance and pride, and putting them down, and you know, treating them as if they were like beneath contempt, not even worth associating with, not even worth talking to. That is something that the Rajput chieftains simply couldn't stomach.
While he was alienating, at this very moment, Aurangzeb opens up correspondence. In fact, the Rajput king, you know, writes into Aurangzeb, and there is a secret correspondence between them. And also Aurangzeb's Deccan campaigns have started in right earnest, and he's actually sewing up with the king of Golconda, you know, allegiances. And he's also bought Mir Jumla onto his side. So while Dara is alienating, Aurangzeb is creating,
consolidating. He's consolidating
and consolidating, right?
Yes, yes.
And of course, Dara's publication of the famous Majma al-Bahrain, the, you know, mingling of the 2 oceans, where he literally comes out of this dream and says that now I know what I'm here for. I'm here to bring these 2 faiths together and things like that. And he starts to badmouth Aurangzeb, saying, "Ye to namazi hai," you know,
yes,
those kind of derogatory terms, and Aurangzeb also then literally takes the cue and starts to call Dara a kafir.
yes.
So that, you know, that the 2 brothers become literally the poles around which everything is coagulating now.
Yes, that's something that's very interesting. So, you know, the polarization is happening then on 2 or 3 different levels. One is geographically, because Dara, at the height of his power, he's like the Shaibul and Iqbal, he's the crown prince, which is not the norm in the Islamic 8th world, as we know, in Islamic empires, certainly not in the Mughal Empire. But he is restricted to the capital. He is literally going from Delhi to Agra to Lahore to Kashmir, coming back to Delhi, Shahjahanabad. That is his purview. Whereas Aurangzeb, he has this entire terrain of an expanding terrain of the Deccan to form his alliances, to form his truces, and to hatch all his conspiracies, and slowly taking his other brothers, in particular Murad Bakhsh, into his confidence and against Dara Shukoh.
Yeah.
That is on the geographic level. On the ideological level, Dara Shukoh manages to alienate the hardliners of both faiths, but particularly the very powerful ulema. Aurangzeb, on the other hand, professes and demonstrates himself to be the true Muslim in true tradition of Sunni Islam, and therefore endears himself to the ulemas at court and elsewhere in the empire. So that's the ideological battle that's been formed. And third, the actual military thing that's brewing up, that's festering, is Dara Shukoh, even after the disastrous campaign of Kandahar, does not go into any kind of anything that would pass off for training, or forget training, introspection. Why did we lose this? The lessons learned. What did we learn from this? how do we consolidate the empire? How do I actually lead an army going forward? There was none of that, whereas Aurangzeb is literally going from strength to strength. Within his forces, having truces and consolidating his army, strengthening that, forging alliances with Rajput Rajas such as Jai Singh, and through him already beginning to influence the likes of Jaswant Singh of Jodhpur. So 3 different levels of polarization, and they're absolutely opposites, which is amazing, really.
So now, Avik, in the interest of time, I'm going to speed up a little. It's interesting because finally Dara publishes his Sere Akbar, the Great Secret, as he called it. And he literally gives the Vedas and the Upanishads a status even higher than the Quran in some senses, and tells people to learn from there and, learn from the example of the Upanishads. And that literally, seals,
Yes.
the fate of Dara. And of course, shortly thereafter, Shah Jahan falls ill in 1657. And then suddenly there is a management of information in terms of what goes out. And that leads people to believe that maybe Shah Jahan is dead.
Yes.
And suddenly everyone gets galvanized. And, the imperial troops under Jaswant Singh are sent to stop Aurangzeb and Murad, who are, moving north now.
North towards the capital, yes.
And of course, near Dharmat, there's a big battle in which Jaswant loses and rushes off back. And it's amazing that it is seen as such a humiliating episode that his wife locks the palace gates and says, "Don't come here. You're embarrassment." And on the other side, Sulaiman Shikoh has gone out and he is defeated Shuja. And then, of course, they come, they're near Gwalior, and finally Dara is compelled to kind of head out with a force. And there's, he gets, he thought he had planned it all. And then Aurangzeb outsmarts him by crossing the Chambal and coming onto the other side without him knowing. And that's when all of these things start to unravel and Samugar happens, the famous Battle of Samugar.
Yes, absolutely.
So talk us through that. That's an incredible one, because you can see now how all the enmities that he had, literally picked up along the way, including, the treachery of Khalilullah.
And this is incredible because it, from there on, there was no turning back for either of the opposing forces. Aurangzeb was going to win from then on, and Dara was going to become the fugitive and the exile in his own empire. And from there on, there was the pursuit was completely relentless. And latter-day historians, right, Paul, as we know, have likened, in terms of its significance, in terms of its importance, to the way history played out through the ages. This battle has been said to be as important as the Battle of Buxar or the Battle of Plassey or the Battle of Panipat, or one of those battles of Panipat, any one of those battles of Panipat. Because from here on, from an ideological, so let me go back to the ideological front, right? So the dreamer, the pluralist, the syncretic philosopher prince can never become the philosopher king. Whereas the hardliner is going to become the emperor. So that is one thing which is absolutely writ large. Now, what happens again in the Battle of Samugar, the reason why Dara loses is multiple different factors, and historians such as Jodhnath Sharkar have deconstructed this at length. One, of course, was his inexperience. 2, relying on the wrong people. 3, treachery, which again goes back to his own character and the way that he had alienated people. So in spite of the fact that he had prevented Khalilullah from having his moment of glory and taking over Srinagar, when it comes to heading out, he still takes Khalilullah Khan and has tens of thousands of forces under Khalilullah Khan and entrusts him to do the job in the field of battle. I mean, this is bizarre. I mean, if you think about it, right, it would not make sense. Anybody else would not even take Khalilullah Khan with him on the campaign and would take a very small number of people who were really, really devoted to him. Not so Dara Shukoh. And Khalilullah Khan literally does a Mir Zafar. He abstains from the field of battle and then he defects. He moves to the enemy camp later on. So multiple things happen. It's a battle which lasts only a few hours in scorching heat, and it's of high drama, which I've tried to recreate in the book. But the outcome is telling. Dara Shukoh loses and becomes, literally within a matter of hours, from the crown prince, from the Shah-e-Buland Iqbal, to an outlaw.
Yes. So this happens in towards the end of May 1658, and then begins the big, journey of trying to stay out of reach of forces that Aurangzeb
is. Of the pursuing forces, yes.
Yeah, and of course, from Sabhugarh to Agra to Delhi to Lahore to Bhakkar to back to Ahmedabad, and then realizing progressively that everyone, the Rajputs, the
Mughals, yes,
the Mughal generals, everyone, the ulema, the members in the family, including his sister Roshanara, who all of them have deserted him. And finally, he decides to emulate Humayun and escape to Persia, and at the literally last minute is again betrayed by a man whose life he had saved at court, Malik Jivan. And Malik Jivan captures him and brings him to Delhi.
Indeed. And from there on, Dara's fate is sealed.
Yeah. So he is brought to Delhi, and he's taken to the fort of Khizrabad, which is a little where today, if people are familiar with Delhi, behind French colony in thereabouts.
Yes.
And finally he is marched, and that's when Aurangzeb realizes that he still commands a lot of public support and sympathy, which Aurangzeb is not happy about. And Aurangzeb literally tells his his keepers that basically get rid of him. And so on 30th of August 1659, so he is on the run from end of May 1659 through to 30th of August, when he is killed. His son Sibir is taken and
incarcerated at Gwalior,
in the Gwalior fort, and this head is cleaned, put on a plate, and they say presented to Shah Jahan,
who is under house arrest at that point of time in the Agra fort.
In the Agra fort. So
yes.
There ends the story of Dara Shukoh, the Sufi, the syncretic, person with syncretic philosophy, the learned author, loyal husband, pacifist, lover of the arts, mystic, dreamer, 44-year-old, not to be emperor of Hindustan, even though he was officially made the heir by Shah Jahan.
Indeed.
So wonderful. We'll stop here and take any quick questions that we may have. Thank you.
So Paul, I can see a couple of them in the Q&A box, if you look at it.
Ascended the throne and somehow consolidated power, defeating his brothers. Can we say the fate of the Mughal Empire would be a syncretic one?
This is plunging us way into speculation, because think of the way that this is framed, right? If he had somehow been able to defeat all his brothers. I mean, I've no idea how he would have been able to do that because he was anything but a military commander. Let us look at it this way. I'm going to try and speculate as little as possible. So during the time when he was still the crown prince, he, together with his beloved and equally philosophically minded sister, pluralistic minded sister Jahanara, had interceded with Shah Jahan to waive the pilgrimage tax. So at that point of time, so for instance, let's say you were a Hindu and you were in Delhi and you were going towards Banaras. So you would have to pay a toll tax. And that is on account of the fact that you are a Hindu who is going on pilgrimage. So there would be a tax, the pilgrimage tax. And Dara Shukoh was instrumental in having Shah Jahan waive that tax. So I think it is, I want to speculate as little as possible and stay to facts as much as possible. So a person who does this as a crown prince is unlikely, in my opinion, to reverse it once he became emperor, if he ever became emperor. So from a fiscal policy standpoint, it might be, better than conjecture, almost fair to assume that there would not have been the reimposition of the jizya, there would not have been the reimposition of the pilgrimage tax, something that he fought so much to abolish. So would that in itself have made people happier than the larger populace, the Hindu populace? The answer to that is absolutely yes. Another fact, Mathura, the temple of Mathura was being rebuilt through the money of the Hindu traders, and there was a contingent of Brahmins who made a petition at the imperial court. And this was granted by Shah Jahan. And again, it is no secret that Dara had influenced this decision, this approval. And in fact, the foundation stone, that marble plaque of the Mathura temple being renovated, had in fact been touched and blessed by Shah Jahan himself. Now, this was the kind of influence that Dara was able to wield, Dara and Jahanara again in this case, over their father. Now, again, I would say that it stands to reason, it's logical to assume that somebody who's doing this as a crown prince would extend and continue that same practice of syncretism, of allowing the building of temples and allowing unrestricted access to Hindus to travel and to pray and to worship as they seemed fit, even if he had become emperor, had he become emperor.
I'd like to add something there, Avik, and that is that if we draw a parallel between Dara and say Akbar, Akbar, also had this, desire to bring people together and have, universal peace amongst various religions and things like that. But Akbar was a pragmatist, and for almost all the 50 years of history, he was on the back of a horse or an elephant, fighting battles, hardened. And when it came to taking some tough decisions, he did take them. I think where Dara might have collapsed was, on the one hand, he may have done all the things that brought about a much more syncretic, state of play within the empire, but he may have been found wanting in terms of administrative acumen and skills. And
from that standpoint, Paul, he is more reminiscent of Humayun and the fate that Humayun suffered, right? And of course, it's fair to say that Humayun got lucky. Had Sher Shah Suri not been killed in that almost freak sideshow of a campaign, which had absolutely no military or strategic import whatever, right? It was an accident, the powder keg of one of his own guns just explodes and kills him, right? He had no business being there in the first place. Just a stroke of luck that Humayun was able to make his way back into the Mughal Empire at all. So from that standpoint, I feel that Dara Shukoh might have, even if he had become the emperor, might have suffered a very similar fate to that of Humayun. When it came to administration, when it came to reliance on the wrong set of people, when it came to over sort of reliance on mysticism and astrology, which is the same thing that ailed Humayun too, as we know, astrology. and of course opiates in this case. And then last but not the least, the lack of military acumen, the lack of battle hardiness, which was the same thing that assailed Humayun. So I have a feeling, history eventually might not have been that different.
Yes, and I think at that stage also, I think the physical limits of expansion had been reached. It was impossible to govern all the way from Bengal to, deep down. I mean, I collect coins, and the southernmost mint from where Aurangzeb's coins is Trichy, and the northernmost was Badakhshan. So that's an incredible amount of land to govern. And if
Absolutely.
you have
And
a
on
proper
the
system in
east,
place, you wouldn't be able to do that.
indeed. And on the east, Shaista Khan ventures into modern-day Chittagong in Bangladesh and ventures as far as the interiors of modern-day Assam, right? And fights these battles against the Ahoms, against the likes of Rachid Barfukan and people. Yes, so that was a huge expanse of empire, indeed.
Yeah. So even someone like Aurangzeb, who literally fought till the last day, was finding it tough to keep it.
Extremely difficult to
I think Dara would have
together. Would have folded.
Started the shrinking process much faster.
Indeed.
All right. So on that token, I think on that note, I'll close here. Thanks a lot, Avik. Thanks
so very much, Paul, for inviting us.
Me. Yes, and this will be recorded and it'll be available in the database on YouTube, etc. So we will also, make sure that a lot more people receive the link. Thanks once again, Avik.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.